Hi, quick question for Courtney. Given the role of the banks, how much outreach do you do in the area of promoting impact assessment and these kind of things? Peter was talking about the need to do this, and I agree. And it seems like the private sector is probably in a better position. One, you're holding the money, and so people are sort of looking to you, and you have some influence in that sense. So how much of a program do the Equator banks have in terms of outreach to potential industry looking for finance or people looking for finance?
Thanks. That's a good question. We're actually undergoing a strategic review within the association, and capacity building is a big issue and question for us. I would say most of our resources are about capacity building within financial institutions, first and foremost. But there is a recognized need for capacity building within the impact assessment community. And there's a lot of us who are, I guess it's somewhat coordinated. As an example, I chair a biodiversity and working group within the association, and I'm working with WWF and the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program in developing capacity building programs within impact assessment communities. So I don't think there's necessarily a formal coordinated effort within the association, because that's really focused on capacity building within financial institutions, but we as banks recognize the need.
Courtney, can I ask you a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
Clearly, the major reason why environmental impact assessment of the contaminated lands sort became such a major part of standard real estate practice in the late 80s and early 90s was because the banks insisted on it, and the banks wouldn't loan money unless that kind of assessment had been done. Do you see a day when banks will similarly require a greenhouse gas assessment of projects before, even smaller projects, before they'll help finance them?
Yeah, good question. I'd say absolutely. And the reason for that is that we certainly don't set standards, but we follow the standards of the IFC. And to the extent that the performance standards are moving towards addressing climate change and impact assessment, requiring that, you'll see the whole Equator Principles community requiring the same. So it's a real opportunity to leverage the sector.
I am Norval Collins with CEF Consultants in Nova Scotia. And I want to go back in time when we sort of started impact assessment before we knew what climate change was. And we tended to focus on the effects that our project or program or policy was going to have on our environment. And I remember when I started doing these things, getting to be one of the older people in the crowd. It's always fun. I remember when the section of the EIA called Effects of the Environment on the Project was a fairly simplistic piece of the assessment. And it was important to do. It was important to make sure that the proponent had done their homework and that the project fit within the environment. But the emphasis was on what the effects on the environment was going to be, what the baseline told us about the environment and what it was going to be. To me, now that climate change has come around, we started to be very concerned about greenhouse gas emissions of a project. And that's all good. That's part of the effects of the project on the environment. And then we started to, and I'll give a couple of examples. For example, if we're up in the Canadian Arctic and we have permafrost, and the permafrost melts, then our pipeline or our road disappears. And we started to really get, and same with the Caribbean, a lot of the coastal marine projects, we started to get concerned about extreme weather destroying the infrastructure that we've just built and borrowed money from a bank, for example. And so we started to really get concerned about the effects of the environment on the project. And we started to view that as that's what impact assessment was about and what climate change was in relation to adaptation. And one of the things that I've been saying for a while is where, like I didn't realize till we did a guide on incorporating climate change into impact assessment that we largely tend to view the environment as static, and we apply this project that's going to last 20 years, but we don't change the environment. And now our environment is changing in front of our eyes, but we haven't really adjusted that part of what we're doing. So we may take a project, we may take a program, a policy, whatever it is, and we may be concerned, and I'll use the example, say, of Atlantic salmon, which in my part of the world is something that's always of concern. But they have a very low lethal temperature. It's very easy to imagine under climate change that they're not going to be around to be affected by the project very long. And it makes a huge difference in terms of what the sensitivities of a project are when we're doing an impact assessment. If we actually look at climate change and try to understand how it's changing the environment that we're trying to assess. So I don't have any problems with what we're saying about the importance from lending agencies, the importance of SEA, having done SEAs and see their role. But I also see that we're starting to slide more and more towards doing something different in environmental assessment than we started out to do. We have to watch what our goals are for doing, like what did we start trying to do with impact assessment? Are we doing it? And not immediately slide to where the money is and where the interest is. So it seems to me we still have some work to do to make sure that we're clear on what our objectives are. And I'd just like to hear the comments from, because it's really interesting hearing the perspective from industry, from some development side, from law. And they all have some effect on how we view what's the most important part of impact assessment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I was scribbling all sorts of notes when you were commenting about that. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Act has a requirement to assess the effects of the environment on the project. And I was just thinking that the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act is going to be under review next year, parliamentary review. And I think that aspect of the Act might need more attention as a way of addressing climate change issues. So it's something which I've written down as something which I'll try and get into the review. Thanks.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more that both are essential, the effects of the project on the environment and the effect of the project, of the environment on the project, and I think the latter is only people are beginning to understand how to do that, and I look forward to learning more in this conference how people are thinking through the method of doing that kind of absolutely essential and even more difficult kind of assessment.
You know, I think if we're going to get out of this box we're in, and you know, Bob Watson said no matter what we do over the next 30 years, if we even shut all the smokestacks off, you know, it's still going to be, the climate is going to change. And I thought that's a profound concept. So after 30 years, you know, when my daughter's 50, you know, what sort of a world will she be in? So I'm thinking we've got to be strategic in our audiences. And if you remember the Olympics when all the pro-alpine skiers were mentioning the issues of climate change because of the alpine snowpack in Europe. And I've got similar examples in Canada where ministers of the environment who are passionate about fly fishing get the message about climate change because the streams that they fish in could be impacted. So when it starts coming home to your own personal you know, use of the environment for your own enjoyment, then that's where we need to go. And I'm thinking, why can't any one of us in the room here go out to a hunters and angler convention, you know, the bullet and hook clubs of the world, to talk about how climate change could affect the salmon streams in Nova Scotia and British Columbia. People may not know that. And boy, you may find out that some of those people in the room that are salmon fishermen are extremely powerful, wealthy people. And going, holy geez, I didn't know that. You know, I better talk to my board, figure this out, because I like fishing in that stream. You know, that's where it's got to go, I think, when we start making it a bit more personal. And so maybe if we've got community involvement, we take those messages back to our local communities and sort of break out of our, I'm just in government, that's all I can do, or I'm just in business and that's all I can do. No, we start talking to some of the more subtle strategic linkages.
I'll just make one comment as the private sector bank. I think that's a very interesting comment, and as an impact assessor, an impact assessment practitioner coming into the financial sector, I think I have a unique perspective, and I think the opportunity is within the financial sector is to account for these externalities, these impacts that we're not currently accounting for. And when I mean account, I mean put a cost to them. And, it goes beyond just carbon, but it's also looking at the cost of mangroves, the cost of what happens when we have water shortages. So I think when we start, and that's why I like TeebWeb.net, which is a fantastic website, because it really drives home the importance of the impacts that projects can make. And I think that's where the financial sector is interested, and you can get their attention, is when we frame it in economic terms.